Just even a couple of days ago, we received a visiting team. This group came with a very, very specific agenda as to what they wanted to do. And when they came, they walked through the door. They literally just walked past me to begin taking pictures. They began seeking out children and putting them on their laps without my permission. The children were out playing at their recess. And it took me a second to regather and to redirect these strangers to appropriate interaction with a child that they don't know, and appropriate conduct for photography when they are in a foreign place with local workers that don't speak English and have no idea why these people are here. Created a very tangible separation between us, those working here, those with the relationship with the children, and them walking in and viewing us almost as objects to soak in and to leave and to maybe do a Facebook post later about. The words that they were using were inaccurate. They kept saying orphans. They kept saying these poor children. They were utilizing words of pity, and they didn't realize how offensive it was to the locals that have taken these children and are caring for them every day. They don't see the love and the bond and the relationship going on between those caregivers and the children. And without even realizing, they're coming in and demonstrating a disrespect for these caregivers, for these local caregivers, to a point where they don't want them back.
Welcome to Reimagining Short-Term Missions, a podcast that takes an honest yet hopeful look at the things the church does in the name of missions. A podcast that seeks to inspire Christ followers to rethink the status quo of short-term missions and to forge a better way forward. We feature frank conversations with people from all over the world, those who go on mission trips and those who host them. And we don't shy away from tackling the hard and uncomfortable questions. Questions like, what happens when visitors to other culture contexts remain unaware of their own personal agendas? How might short-term mission trips be transformed into opportunities for learning and listening, and for putting aside assumptions? What if humility and teachability became the hallmarks of all mission trips? I'm Forrest, professor of global studies at Northwest University in Seattle, and co-editor of the book Reimagining Short-Term Missions. I'll be talking to Austin Robinson, a full-time missionary and executive director of Eternal Anchor, a ministry in Mexico that is dedicated to serving children with special needs. Austin is also one of the authors of the book Reimagining Short-Term Missions. His essay, called Re-Symbolizing the White makes the case that the kinds of short-term visitors who actually help more than hurt are those who come with an attitude of humility and teachability and a willingness to come alongside locals who are already doing the work of Jesus. Friends, we can figure out better ways to love and serve the world, and it starts with courageous conversations. Welcome to Reimagining Short-Term Missions. Austin, welcome. Thanks for coming on the podcast to share about your work and your views on short-term missions. Perhaps you could give us all a sense of the work that you do in Mexico.
Thank you for the chance to have this conversation. I moved down to Mexico, to rural Baja California, a little over 10 years ago, and began working with a nonprofit organization that supports children with learning disabilities. In the last 7 years, we've just been growing the organization to meet the holistic needs of children with disabilities, adults with disabilities, and their families, addressing their social, spiritual, physical, medical, their holistic accessibility issues, and trying to work alongside them to find sustainable solutions. So right now my role as executive director is I support 4 local program directors, each with a very specific focus. We do residential care, education programs, adult disability services, and social work and community outreach.
So where does your concern about short-term missions come from, and how is that connected to your current work?
From the very, very beginning when we started, we partnered with churches as a source of not just funding, but as a source of volunteers, short and long term, a source of networking to acquire new knowledge from specialists or specialist services like dental campaigns or physical therapy campaigns, equipment donations. Being Christians, my coworker and I, both of us founders, it was natural for us to seek support in churches that we had relationships with right away. And so a lot of, in the early years, most of the staff we had were a mix of local volunteers and American Canadian volunteers that had come down on a short-term mission trip and extended their stay to support the efforts. 90% of the funding came from people that would come down on a short-term mission trip, experience what we were doing. They would acquire that passion that we had to serve our community, and they would return home and begin to fund our efforts or join us in raising funds. So from the very beginning, we've had a very symbiotic relationship with the international church and specifically short-term mission groups that have come to learn about what we're doing and return home as advocates for the work we're doing.
And of those teams that come to see you, how many are sent, would you say, from churches that maintain kind of a consistent commitment to you, and how many are just sort of one-offs or first-time visits?
When we first started, I would say it was about 50-50 of one-off churches that would just show up and, ask to hang out for a bit or get to learn more about what we do. As we began to grow and as we began to put stricter limitations on what we allow and what we don't allow from visiting teams, and as we began to put more structure to the purpose of why we do this and how we do this, really are the only visiting teams that we receive for a week at a time or 2 weeks at a time are from churches that we have a long-standing relationship with and that are faithful contributors to the work that we do.
So the chapter in the book, Reimagining Short-Term Missions, that you've written is called Re-Symbolizing the White Van. Why that title? What's the story behind that?
The first time I came to Mexico, I came in a white van, a white passenger van, and I didn't think much of it. I mean, it made sense. We had a bunch of people, a bunch of luggage, pack into a large white passenger van and drive across the border and do a short-term mission trip. And every year since, the following years of my teenage years and early adult years, always the same in a white passenger van. And it wasn't until I got to Mexico to live full-time that I realized there is a season in this region in which white vans are everywhere. And it's for the same reason. People show up, they fly into San Diego, they rent a passenger van to fit their team of 12 to 15 people, and they come down and do their volunteer work. And so the community begins to identify when Americans and Canadians are on vacation or when they are able to send visiting teams because of the quantity of white vans that you see at taco stands or you see at the churches or you see at in the community doing campaigns or house builds. And it really, for the locals here, the white van really symbolizes short-term missions, short-term mission groups. They see a white van and they see those are the Christians.
So when they see that white van, what does it actually symbolize beyond the obvious that, it's full of short-termers? Are they, on balance, more positively inclined to receive those white vans? Are they glad to see them, or is it mixed?
It's not a healthy reaction. uh, the relationship between short-term mission groups and the community in which I live is not. It's historically been. It's been one of a high power distance. A team comes down, they have money, they have gifts, they have some kind of campaign to offer, and it's very transactional. I will come, I will give you this, I will ask you if you want to pray with us. I will write down if you did as part of like a checklist and how many, and then I go home. And so I would say it's a positive reaction on their part. They are happy to see them because they associate these teams with money, home builds, food, or just gifts in general. And so again, it's a positive, but I wouldn't say it's healthy.
Well, maybe talk a bit more about that. I mean, having been both on the sending and receiving end of short-term missions, how would you describe some of the core problems with the current approach to short-term missions that you've seen? And do you have a story maybe that could help us understand aspects of the problem?
Just even a couple of days ago, we received a visiting team here at our base for a tour, just for a tour. And that's kind of the rule that I have now. New teams that we don't have a relationship with are more than welcome to visit for a tour and a time of question and answers. Having had a relationship with this region, historically, this group came with a very, very specific agenda as to what they wanted to do. And I'm familiar with their church. I've had interactions just in my day-to-day operations working with other nonprofit organizations in the region. So I knew that they have a tendency to bulldoze local initiatives in order to achieve their agenda. And when they came, they walked through the door, and as I was standing there, they literally just walked past me to begin taking pictures of the installations without my permission. They began seeking out children and putting them on their laps without my permission. The children were out playing at their recess, and it took me a second to regather and to redirect these strangers to appropriate interaction with a child that they don't know, and appropriate conduct for photography when they are in a foreign place with local workers that don't speak English and have no idea why these people are here. It was a bit. It wasn't a bit. It was sad. It was sad, honestly, to see the ignorance manifesting in such a in a cold way. It created a very tangible separation between us, those working here, those with the relationship with the children, and them walking in and viewing us almost as objects to soak in and to leave and to maybe do a Facebook post later about. And I had a conversation with our residential care director afterwards, because she had also taken a couple of them to try and discuss what we were doing, which they demonstrated a strong lack of interest in that. They just genuinely wanted a picture and a photo op with the children. She told me, I really struggled with that, and I didn't know how to engage in dialogue with them, because the words that they were using were inaccurate. They kept saying orphans. They kept saying, these poor children. They were utilizing words of pity, and they didn't realize how offensive it was to the locals that have taken these children and are caring for them every day. They don't see the love and the bond and the relationship going on between those caregivers and the children. And without even realizing, they're coming in and demonstrating a disrespect for these caregivers, for these local caregivers, to a point where they don't want them back. They don't want to engage in that dialogue anymore because it's harmful to them emotionally.
Ostensibly, these teams are coming down to represent the gospel and represent Christian community. And so I can understand how that would really frustrate your efforts to witness to Jesus and to Jesus' love when they're exemplifying something very different. It's a lot more transactional and objectifying. I think not just to you and the other workers there, but to the children as well. I mean, it seems to me that, if your objective is to, hug a child, have a feeling, take a photo, you're really making them into objects that suit your own needs.
Absolutely. And I would add, just because it's something that most visiting teams are very unaware of, is the prevalence of human trafficking in foreign countries, especially in rural regions. And when we go into a community as a stranger and put a child on our lap, we're desensitizing them to what is appropriate touch between a stranger and a child. These same children will seek out that same physical interaction with other strangers long after the short-term mission group leaves. And it leaves them vulnerable to people that will prey on these children. And I can say just in our region, I know people firsthand who have experience with being trafficked. And it happens, it starts like that, with somebody approaching you, offering to give you something, inviting you to a car, inviting you on your lap. From there, it's a life or death issue now. And without understanding it, we're contributing to a very, very dangerous practice.
Even though you've experienced the downsides of short-term trips, you still have hope, it seems. And in the chapter that you wrote for the book, you write, "There's a desperate need to redeem short-term missions. The practice of short-term trips, typically a week or two spent volunteering in a foreign, high-poverty context, has become broken and often toxic, yet still holds great potential for advancing social justice causes and manifesting God's perfect love to people who are oppressed and marginalized around the globe." I am wondering, what's the potential that you see? In other words, what might it look like if short-term missions were actually done well?
Again, it reminds me of a conversation I had recently with another nonprofit worker who asked me, why am I so passionate about churches being the ones to go and partner with these international nonprofit organizations? Why, as an executive director, do I still cling to the possibility of a healthier collaboration with churches when there are plenty of secular humanitarian organizations that can do the same thing? Why churches? Why Christians? Why short-term missions? And simply put, I told her, then the foundational values of Christianity, the core message of Jesus, is exactly what we're trying to manifest. And instead of trying to look around and find volunteers or individuals with that base foundation that we can share, there's an entire institution that supposedly should be preaching and living that message of of respect, of love, of extreme giving, of radical inclusion. These messages, we don't have to look very far to find them. They're the messages and teachings of Jesus. And so when the gospel message is truly operative, the power it has to change culture, to change society, to make systemic changes is massive. And right now, the American and Canadian churches that we partner with have a unique platform. They have money, they have voice, they have opportunity. And so partnering with them isn't just a way for us to get money. Ideally, what we're doing here is creating a relationship in which we can grow mutually. We are learning from each other in the different contexts in which we come from. And we are building a better future for us here and the community here. And then they take what they've learned here and they go back and they apply it there. And we're both, it's a long-term collaboration, relationship in which we are manifesting God's love in this particular context of disability, wherever we're at.
It sounds a lot like you're describing this word co-powerment that other authors in the book have used as well. How is co-powerment sort of at the heart of what you're talking about in terms of this collaborative partnership, those two words that you use? How would you define co-powerment, and do you see it much?
I'm going to be very specific here. Being in a very rural region with limited access to government resources, we have to be very creative in our intervention strategies. So the specialists that come down, in the beginning it was a very traditional approach to short-term mission trips where specialists would come with the knowledge they had, host a training in a very Western American manner, and then leave. And we very quickly realized in the first 2 years, this is not working. Our staff are not understanding. The local community is not really taking anything away from this that's applicable. While the knowledge may be relevant in their context, when they come here, it's not relevant, and their insights are not helpful. And in some cases, they were offensive. So we began to start working with local international specialists before they came and began recommending literature. We began having Zoom calls before to explain the context, explain the culture, and explain how they can utilize their giftings to partner with our organization and build capacity. Now when they come with that in mind, with that lens and that perspective, it's actually really cool to have physical therapy professionals with a doctoral degree come down, work alongside somebody with a primary or secondary education who has been working on adaptive equipment for a couple years now. There is knowledge being shared now from the perspective of somebody with the academic and clinical experience, and then the NGO worker with very, very practical knowledge, with limited resources. That they often find that the solutions that our staff are applying to different issues are solutions that they can end up taking back to their consults in the US and bypass expensive insurance interventions with a very, very simple, low-cost hardware store purchase. They've now made a life-changing alteration to a child's life. And that knowledge now, it empowers locals to have that affirmation and that celebration. It empowers the specialist that's coming down, because they now see that it's collaborative. They're gaining knowledge. They're sharing ideas on how to tweak things to make it more efficient. It's a very, very, again, I'm using the word a lot, but it's very collaborative. It's no one person is in charge of the relationship. No one person is coming to impose an agenda. Both are very open and willing to work together towards a very mutual goal.
It seems to me that a lot of that dynamic is prefaced on the fact that you can actually somehow encourage the experts who are coming down to actually view things from a stance of humility. Because, we have so much in the Western expert mentality that we must know all the answers in order to be legitimate. There's not a lot of room for this sort of mutuality of learning that you're talking about. So I'm wondering, is that part of your preparation process before they come down? Are you helping them to understand that it's more than a strategy to share knowledge? It's also kind of a mindset, or we'll call it a heart set, right? That is willing to be transformed by the work and by the people they're coming to work with.
It's emotional preparation. I mean, it's getting them to understand the larger picture outside of their own worldview, outside of their own perspectives, outside of their own contexts. It's getting them to understand the big picture of humanity, the big picture of what we're trying to accomplish. And when they're traveling across an international border, they have to take off the caps that they have in their professional context. They do need to kind of strip down, and we have a period of just observation, where instead of coming and they assume locals are incapable of doing something, instead of coming and training on topics that perhaps locals already know, they have to come and sit. They have to operate as assistants. In our school, we have lead teachers and we have assistant teachers. When we have special education professionals visit, and the first day or two, they're down on their hands and knees doing the work of an assistant teacher, working one-on-one. And they have to be coached to come and understand that they're not above that. And in fact, coming with that posture increases the possibility for sustainable learning. Our staff are going to be far more receptive to knowledge when they see a specialist come down with a desire, a noticeable desire to learn first what is happening, what are the good things happening. I want to encourage you, I want to support you, and then they're open to hear feedback and ideas, and it turns into a conversation instead of a checklist of what am I doing wrong.
So what would you say then to those like you who receive short-term teams? How can they be a part of maybe resisting that sort of status quo practice of short-term missions and helping them to create a new paradigm?
So changing culture is not easy, and it comes with the sacrifice. And honestly, what I would tell them is don't settle for what is convenient, what is easy. There are fundraising strategies that are very, very, very easy to apply. But they are costing the organization something. They are compromising the values that we should be adhering to. They're compromising the relationship we have with our staff and our community. And they're really perpetuating cycles of condescension and patronization. We are responsible to break those cycles. And if we're not willing to face some of the immediate consequences, financial consequences, things aren't going to change. We have to be willing to maybe let go of some funding sources and engage with church groups that are willing to make positive changes to their strategies and in their practices and build something better.
There's something really powerful about that image that literally they have to get down on their hands and knees in order to work with the kids, right? But it's not just a heart stance, it's a physical stance where you're getting down onto the ground. I think there's something quite poignant about that image. So I wonder if you could offer some advice to people who are interested in reimagining short-term missions. Let me ask you first, what would you say to those who would normally be sending teams cross-culturally, or even to the people on the teams? What would some of your advice be?
For me, I've always started, do your research. Determine why are you going? Why are you going to this place? Do they need you? Do they want you? Or do they really want a blank check? Do they see you as a wallet, or do they see you as a relationship? Figure out what is the goal of the relationship. What is the goal of the trip? What's the long-term, what's the plan? Why are you doing this? In a lot of cases, the goal is not relationship. The goal is a very finite outcome, whether it's a house build or X amount of people hearing a gospel message. So if that is the case, and you have gone into a foreign context in a foreign community with your set outcome that you have determined, I would encourage those teams to reassess strongly how they do short-term missions. I would put the ball back in the court of the local organizations that they're hoping to collaborate with and allow them to dictate the agenda, allow them to dictate the outcomes, allow them to dictate how the week is going to look, and to put limitations, strong limitations on the size of the team, on the length of the trip, and on the activities that the group does.
You've been listening to the Reimagining Short-Term Missions podcast. If you want to explore more diverse and challenging perspectives like this, check out a new book called Reimagining Short-Term Missions, which includes chapters written by our podcast guests and from many more STM innovators from around the world. Your podcast host is Forrest Inslee, co-editor of that book and a professor of global studies at Northwest University in Seattle. Angel Burns is the book's co-editor, and our podcast producer is Heath Hollinsby. Friends, what we need now is nothing short of a revolution in short-term missions. So please help us spread the word by sharing this podcast with others of like heart and mind. This is the time for reimagining short-term missions.